Belinda Schäpe, and I'm working on climate diplomacy at E3G with a special focus on China. E3G is an independent climate think tank with offices in London, Brussels, Berlin, and Washington. Today's event is co-hosted with China Dialogue, and China Dialogue is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting a common understanding of and constructive dialogue on China's environmental challenges. According to the 2019 IEA Africa Energy Outlook, Africa needs around 2 trillion of investments for reliable, sustainable, and affordable power over the next 2 decades. So far, Chinese financial institutions have been the major investors in African energy infrastructure over the past 2 decades. Now, G7 countries have pledged to increase their support for renewable energy in developing countries, including through the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, and most recently last weekend through the new G7 Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, which aims to mobilize 600 billion over the next 5 years. But the area is fraught with problems and information gaps. So questions arise around, can the G7 countries deliver on their promises? Can China support renewables at the same scale as it did fossil fuels previously? And what do African governments and African countries really want to gain from these initiatives? And where are the areas for cooperation and complementarity? With this great panel today, we hope to shed some light on these questions, and we try to bring a trilateral perspective to the topic of renewable development. This panel is being live streamed, and the recording will be made available on the E3G and China Dialogue websites. We will have a Q&A session after the panel discussion, so please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A section at any point, and we will pick them up later. Also, to give you a quick outlook, E3G will be conducting further research on the role of China and South-South cooperation on climate change, and China Dialogue will be working on a report on China-Africa cooperation on renewables, as well as a series of on-the-ground reporting on China's involvement in renewables across the continent. So stay tuned for more from us in this space, and please do get in touch if you're working in the field and would like to connect. With this, I will be handing over to our brilliant chair, Salim Fakir. Many of you will know him as he's an expert in the fields of climate, geopolitics, and finance economics. And of course, he's the founder and executive director of the African Climate Foundation. So thank you for being here, and over to you, Salim.
Thank you very much, Belinda, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's a great pleasure to be able to chair what I think will be really an interesting set of inputs and hopefully good panel discussion with some of the best thinkers and researchers on this particular topic. And I think that I also want to thank E3G and China Dialogue for inviting me to chair this. It's always an honor to do so. Before I introduce the speakers, I just want to try to set the scene and give each of the speakers an opportunity to say something about the topic. I think it's fair to say that given the shift in the debate globally, first we had a marker being set a year or two ago in that everybody around the world has to figure out a way to get to net zero, particularly advanced economies, a bigger challenge for emerging and developing countries, which also need support and financing to be able to achieve the net zero goal. Somewhat of a disruption of that in the last year, given the war in the Ukraine and I would say intense geopolitics revolving around that, in which energy security now is overtaking, and it was even reflected in the G7 statement taking precedence over energy security. So we are having to march in two parallel processes. One, to achieve energy security, which in the interim phase will require more investments in gas. And that's a bit of an interesting challenge. And in the other time, the intensification of a transition process building around renewables, hydrogen, storage technologies, and electric vehicles. Be that as it may, we are obviously very keen to understand the role of China, particularly on the African continent. China is the biggest investor in the power infrastructure on the continent, but has largely focused on large hydro projects. And as one of our colleagues, Wei Shen, will show, who did a piece of work for the African Climate Foundation, the role of China in renewables is likely to shift, given that in 2020, there was some really interesting announcement made around FOCAC, and which is basically the China-Africa dialogue. And and I think Wei Shen will share some light on this, on how China is busy building a new vision, hopefully, around expanding its support and for energy transitions on the continent, in the light of the fact that Africa needs about $330 billion of investment by 2030 for a range of investments in the clean energy space. Now, China has the capacity to do so because it has one of the forefront technology companies in wind and solar, and also electric vehicles and battery storage, and rapidly expanding the scope of these companies to operate globally. Secondly, as we've noted, China is the leading player in infrastructure investments on the continent, particularly in the power sector. And China's experience on the continent is growing, and its ability to integrate these aspects of technology investments with other aspects of the resource endowment on the continent is critical. People also should not forget that China has significant technology and investments in power sector infrastructure in general, particularly transmission and other types of infrastructure. So I'm just as eager to hear about the possibilities of expanding renewables on scale on the continent. And I would like to move on to then introducing the three main speakers who will speak for 10 minutes each. And I won't go read the entire CVs, but I'll just introduce the different speakers. Ovigwe Igegu, he's from Development Reimagine, which the ACF is also working with closely. He has a deep research interest and in issues of geopolitics, energy, and particularly around, I would say, just reading from his CV, questions of geopolitics and energy and the global order. So we will hear from him. Wei Shen, who also did a piece of work for the ACF. He's a political economist who worked on development finance with development finance agencies in China for the last 10 years, and also increasingly focusing on the Chinese DFI, the role of Chinese DFIs in supporting infrastructure investments on the continent. And then we have Leah Polsner, not related to the famous drink, the Polsner drink, and she's a policy advisor at E3G's Brussels office, and her role is to focus on supporting the EU climate neutrality by 2050. She's been very extensively involved in the EU Green Deal, as I understand, and I would just say that I wanted to welcome each one of them, and just to encourage them to stick to time. And if I can invite Ovigwe to make some opening remarks, and then we'll move to Wei Shen, Shen Wei, and Leah Polsner after that. Thank you. Ovigwe, if I can hand over to you, please. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Fakir, for that very kind introduction. And once again, really appreciate the invitation to be here today to make my contribution. So, for my research and experience, looking at this, the issue regards to renewable energy on the continent, I would say that investments in renewable energy are actually increasing rapidly in Africa with so much interest. Of course, where we have to ensure that the extent the extent and conditions this investment will produce economic co-benefits, and in terms of spillover and linkages to development is very important, because if we look at what we've seen with other investment areas, particularly focusing more on energy, that's hydrocarbons in the past, not enough was done in terms of economic co-benefits and spillover and linkage to development. You just have like a very extractive model, and you export, and states are just able to get something from taxation, as source of revenue. So, I mean, when it comes to the main partners or the main players, when we're looking at Africa's development of the renewable sector, of course, China is a very important partner. And just in the last FOCAC, we saw that there is an open and very clear commitment from both African countries and China, to really to incorporate energy transition cooperation into that forum of China-Africa cooperation, giving impetus to how that development can go on, setting the stage rather for how development of both sides can go on. And if we look at the recent history or this recent trend, I think even the documents as well, there's certain clearly commitment to strengthen effort to build resilience to climate change. There's commitment to curb, greenhouse gas emissions via investment of, and green development, parts, and also to search for financing, innovative financing, financing for these, energy project and even climate resilience. But however, I think why FOCAC is very important, or why what we saw in FOCAC is very important, is because up until now, in terms of scale and of investment, majority of it has been in fossil fuel industry. As an example, if you look at, say, maybe the deal between ZESCO and Power China, in 2020, which is like the biggest non-hydro renewable energy project China has financed, that is just about $548 million to build, solar PV plants, 3 solar PV plants in Zambia. And then you contrast that to the largest construction for coal related project or coal-fired power plant in Hwange, Zimbabwe. The volume of that investment was 1.5 billion. So of course, we definitely believe and expect that that scale of investment in coal-fired plants in the coming future, what we'll be seeing in the renewable sector, because the potential is huge across the continent, whether it's hydro and solar. These are two major areas where I think there's a lot of investment opportunities. But that doesn't mean there won't be challenges, or there are no challenges, because even if looking at how China even approaches, the energy transition, recognize or doesn't use the term just transition. So the term it uses, it's green transition, And for any observer, you can see why, to some extent, that the difference will be there because of the definitions of the just transition and how that tries to put responsibility on certain partners, for the transition and what that would look like. And then green transition, which is as a more suitable, way to define the cooperation, is actually also very encompassing because things like resilience, is also very, very important, and the kinds of projects that would be getting priority as well is wider because it's not just, it's beyond electricity as an issue when we're looking at the just energy transition. But beyond that, I also think it's important to really touch on, why while there's a lot of cooperation with China, there's also cooperation with Western countries with regards to the transition on the continent. For instance, after COP26 or following COP26, we saw the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa, UK, United States, Germany, I think European Union as well. So it's a step in the right direction because, of course, that opens access to South Africa getting over 8 billion in financing for it to transition away from coal. South Africa being the 12th largest carbon emitter, in the continent. So it's quite good to see that kind of, those kind of partnerships, and that is very targeted in the sense to one country. But on the Chinese side, if you look at what we've seen on China-Africa cooperation on energy, such a very clear and very direct and comprehensive model doesn't really exist, where one particular country has an agreement with China to get XYZ amount of financing and then make commitments to cut carbon emissions or how it's going to transition in that sense. So on one hand, we see that while with FOCAC the foundation has been set, two issues really come up. So what was the model of the cooperation going to be like, and are we going to see the same are we going to have the same issues? For instance, if you look at how China is involved in Africa currently, is mostly in EPCs, right? So plus financing of course, very little project development. So with that kind of with FOCAC, setting that the platform for cooperation, it's going to be very important to see how both sides can move forward, to create new financing approaches, and also maybe full comprehensive model to see how this we can actually work closely. Already with the whether in Garissa in Kenya or Adama in Ethiopia and Bui in Ghana, where China has really invested both solar and hydro. Yes, those projects have been successful to a large extent, but it's just so small compared to the potential that the continent has, and also the potential of China-Africa relations, or at least China's financing capacity to actually tap into many projects. So once we can really get, now that we really have that strong commitment, diplomatic commitment at the FOCAC level, of course, it means a lot can now be done going forward. So, but I would also like to mention that the environmental considerations will be very environmentalism rather will be very, very important in how Africa is going to be able to tap into its renewable energy potential. if you recall, we had there was in the mid 2000s, and when Ethiopia was trying to develop GB3 dam, there were a lot of concerns around what the environmental impact would be. Ethiopia, of course, ended up financing the project, but when it came to the electrical and mechanical equipment, they were looking forward to the World Bank, to the European Investment Bank, and even African Development Bank to finance that. But of course, that didn't come to fruition because of studies into the environmental impact that was financed by the AIB, and that was very problematic for Ethiopia. It was the Chinese that ended up financing, that component of the project. The same problems we saw again with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, whereby financing was very difficult coming from the west, from Western multilateral development banks and all of that. So I think it will be very crucial when we're looking at why there are issues with China when we want to move forward with Western countries. I think one of the major areas that, apart from financing, would be how does Africa's transition really fit into the real hypercharged environmentalism that really is, we see in Western countries. So with that, I think I would stop there and just let other speakers throw in their points.
Thank you, Ivekwe. Just to tell speakers, if I put my camera on, it means you've got 2 minutes left. That's a signal. It's the only way I can get you to recognize that the time has come up. Before I invite Shenwei, I just want to pick up on 3 things that you mentioned, which I think is pertinent. The importance of China's role in the economic development and on the continent. I think that is manifesting and building up and strengthening, given the last FOCAC meeting. The second point you mentioned is that the scale of investments in clean energy or renewables is not as high as it should be compared to coal and other fossil fuels. And third is that many of these investments, and particularly in the infrastructure space, have to take into account environmental issues, and I would also assume social and other issues, given that there's a big focus on the just transition on the continent now. And as you would know, Victor, the African Development Bank is also running a number of sub-regional roundtables on the just transition and is trying to get more involved in that. So I'm going to open the floor and invite Shenwei or Wei-Shen to make inputs for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll go to Leah. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim, and for the introduction, and also thank you E3G and China Dialogue for inviting me to this very exciting event. And as a researcher on Chinese engagement in Africa's energy market, it is my great pleasure to share some of our recent findings. Thanks for the funding support of the ACF, and also some reflections regarding China's power generation activities in Africa in the past 2 or 3 decades, and more specifically on some new trends since the China's announcement of stop financing overseas and coal-fired power plants last year, and also then the FOCAC as mentioned by Salim and other speakers already. And yes, China delivered a large amount of power generation infrastructures in Africa in the past 20 years, and we just did a synthetic database on these activities, and we found we identified around less than 70 Chinese projects. And they amount to about $65 billion across African continent. And you can be amazed, you can be alarmed, depending on your perspectives. But I think the first point I want to make is that if you look at such attainment, it can be reviewed as a very steep learning curve for the Chinese companies and the financial institutions and even government officials in the past 2 decades. And imagine that 20 years ago, and these project managers were still kind of trying to figure out what is a performance bound, what is a letter of credit, what is the difference between buyer credit facility or seller credit facility, those basic things 20 years ago. And how they learn from their counterparts from OECD countries, and how they try to study specific terms under PPA or EPC contracts, and even simply copy and paste some of the risk management tools, financial documents, and insurance policies into their daily operations. So it is quite an amazing journey for them. But what can we learn from a research point of view, and to understand, their growth in how they grow into such a kind of a gigantic entities, and how they actually develop a very complex and kind of enclosed networks around themselves in the past 20 years. So these are the few lessons that maybe I want to share. I think the first feature of Chinese investment is that they focus on two things. First is like they really focus on the energy endowment. Their investment, their activities are very highly aligned with the African energy endowment, to focus on the most abundant, cheapest, and the most exploitable resources, which means in Eastern, as Selim already pointed out, that in Eastern African regions, it's mainly about hydropower that dominate the landscape. And in Southern African countries, it's mainly coal-fired power plants. And in Western African countries, it's about half-half, between hydro and the gas power plants. And that's one of their focus. The other focus is that they really focus on commercial values rather than other kind of non-commercial values. So there's a common fallacy that the Chinese projects are actually facilitated from the top down by the Chinese government, which is really not true. I think there are more and more researchers, studies already prove that it is really a kind of bottom-up initiatives, bottom-up process when the large Chinese companies are trying to secure the deals, trying to push forwards the finance arrangement and so on. So it is mainly commercially driven, and it is kind of a single-purposed kind of a strategy among these Chinese actors, which means that some of the social and environmental impacts that previously mentioned already kind of overlooked. And so the advantages, of course, is like it can be very effective and very pragmatic, very quick, but the side effects is also obvious. But the Chinese, but I think gradually in the past few years, the Chinese government realized this can be a problem. So they actually started to gradually focusing on this kind of non-commercial values, and the geopolitical ones, the soft power, and also environmental and social values as well. So there are some policy changes after 2017, and the proposal of green BRIs, one of them, the proposal of green finance, and then the announcement of stop financing coal-fired power plants overseas in the last year, and followed, which was kind of further legitimized in the FOCAC meeting. So just a very quick note is that if you look at the timing of the Chinese announcement of stop financing overseas coal power plants, the announcement is actually earlier than OECD's similar announcement, which is followed Chinese announcement 1 month later in October. That if you look at OECD's website, they announced they would stop ECA support for the coal power plants. So Chinese decisions also already have a global impact, but the most significant impacts is within the Chinese kind of SOEs and the Development Finance Institute. They treated it very seriously, and because this kind of a paradigm change for them. And I think there are endless webinars going on now within China, organized by these major players to talk about the future opportunities and the challenges and so on. But at the same time, there are new transactions that are being discussed. I think we already see new transactions in Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. So again, I think we can expect a lot more renewable energy projects undertaken by the Chinese. They mainly look at these new projects as new opportunities because they're convinced that renewable energy resources, solar and wind, and solar in particular, and in some cases geothermal in some countries in Ethiopia and so on, are really changing the existing energy endowment. As I said, they are really focusing on energy endowment. Once they are convinced that renewable energy are already kind of significantly changing the energy endowment, they will pursue like they pursue conventional projects. And it is also follow the original kind of mercantilist approach, focusing on commercial values. But the question is that whether they can achieve the same level of attainment as they did in supporting conventional projects as in the past 2 decades. I think there are still some challenges ahead. I think Wigui and Salim already mentioned that most of these conventional projects are EPCs and undertaken by the public entities, and normally a monopolistic utility company and supported by the African governments, right? So mainly public projects. But for most of the renewable energy projects nowadays, it's mainly private companies that are taking as a project developers. So whether these private entities will still prefer Chinese contractors to construct these projects is questionable, right? So that's one question mark. The other is like, Salim mentioned that many Chinese companies' technological and financial capacities, which is true. But for the SOEs, they are less motivated and less capable to transform themselves as project developers. I think the same observation we just mentioned just now. And for the Chinese private companies, they are very happy to be just a supplier exporting panels and turbines and so on. Again, not very keen to take on the equity investment of project development. So who can fill the gap? That's another big question hanging around. So, and for the Chinese financial institutions, 1 minute. For the Chinese financial institutions, development banks and the financial, the insurance company, they need to be more flexible. They need to welcome more flexible project model, a business model, when Chinese entities only take a minor role. As a small shareholder, as a minor kind of supplier of the equipments and so on, whether they are able to do that, and even to cover some non-Chinese content without any sovereign guarantee. So these are the very practical challenges they're facing, whether they can be versatile, they can be flexible to support these kind of non-alternative project models. That's another challenge. And there's a tremendous gap for small projects, off-grid, mini-grid systems, and China seldom touch upon, right? So these are the challenges ahead, and we're still waiting for the answer, but I think these could be the potential areas for trilateral and multilateral cooperations. And it is a new learning journey for most of the Chinese actors. I think I will stop here and look forward for more discussions in these areas.
Thank you, Wei Shen. I really appreciate that you stick to time. I just wanted to pick up a couple of points that you mentioned. The one is that I think we are shifting towards a new paradigm, and you mentioned the Chinese government's decision not to support any more overseas investments in coal. But there are, of course, questions about non-state entities and whether they could continue to finance coal. And there was, Ovigwe raised the question about coal in Zimbabwe, and I would be curious later on for you to just clarify how that is happening in Zimbabwe. The second part is that there's an internal debate and process going on in China about the opportunity for renewables expansion, which is a non-conventional investments outside of the state entities, because the holders of technology and the people who are invested commercially in the value chain for renewables, particularly wind, solar, battery, and so on, they are not necessarily benefiting from the kind of state support that would go into supporting the Chinese, like China Power and others who are building large dams and other projects. So it's very important to understand that there are two different settings. One is that there's a private, commercial, and matured industry in the renewable sector, and then there was the conventional project. And I think you alluded to that there is a need for cultural and paradigm shift in the state entities to be able to play a bigger role and support the private companies. And maybe later on you want to talk about how that is unfolding. And the last part is around the a need for the finance institutions to start thinking about given that they're not going to finance any more coal plants outside, how they could finance and also mitigate and ensure political risk for larger scale projects outside of China. So I want to leave it at that, and then in Q&A, I've got lots of interesting questions for you. I'm going to invite Leah to say something for the next 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today with a great set of co-panelists and hosts. So I think today my intervention, since we're talking about infrastructure initiative, and I'm mostly focused on the EU side of things, will be to kind of talk you through a little bit about the elusive Global Gateway initiative, which is the latest sort of, it's something, I'll start actually with what it is, because I think there is a lot out there. So it's something that started, or that's been kicked off last year at the highest level of the European Union, and that means a lot when the whole sort of political leadership is behind it. As an infrastructure investment strategy of 300 billion euro that are meant to be disbursed globally, so not just Africa, over the next 6 to 7 years, but it's actually several things at once. A lot of the time with the EU, it's like that, where it's for the EU, it's also very much a strategy to sort of get a bit of a political return on its involvement, its existing involvement on economic cooperation, development aid, and so on in Africa, but also other geographies in that context of competition, precisely from China, but also Russia. So it's to see it a bit as sort of the EU's geopolitical awakening. And next to that, it's also, as a result, an engagement and cooperation strategy. That's on paper, and that's why it sort of really very much majors on the political vision of proposing that alternative, very much centered around sort of values and principles, again, in that logic of, needing to be different as an offer to the market, let's say. And that's why with big focuses around principles like partnerships, transparency, sustainability, and yeah, the green dimension is very prominent in there, given that it's meant to sort of propose what the EU does, what the EU did, and this commitment to net zero domestically, and the Green Deal. Well, it's sort of building on that, sort of have a bit of an external dimension to this, but excuse me, not just. And with Africa in particular. So, as I said, this is meant to be a global strategy, as the name would tell you. But basically, what's really interesting is that this thing being fairly recent and fairly sort of, I don't want to say amorphous, but, in the process of being developed, well, it started its development or the focus with the African Union and the summit earlier this year is really what kickstarted sort of a specific package dedicated for Africa. We're talking about what the Commission says, 150 billion euro that indeed came out of this EU-African Union cooperation process. And yeah, with that specific investment package focusing on what sort of, for now, these are all just big words, right? Green, digital transition, health, education, and transport. And in terms of finance, this is meant to be financed with sort of existing funds that the EU has, but also with a big chunk of leveraging private investment as well. And very practically speaking, the strategy really at the moment is aiming to identify those high impact and visible projects, having or trying to work on sort of streamlined financing schemes and mobilizing the private sector. And because it's very political in its nature, the visibility dimension is important for the EU, the branding dimension. And for that, sort of for this to be success, there's also a big effort needed when it comes to sort of cooperation and coordination, both within the EU, but with sort of all the stakeholders that would be partnering with this. And just in terms of current state of where we're at, given that it's very much in flux. So there's a lot of criticism as to, especially compared precisely to what the Chinese BRI is able to put on the table, that it's less efficient and it's slow. I just want to set the record straight here is that the EU decided this sort of last year, and for a union of 27 member states, it's actually doing fairly well in trying to put things in motion. So yes, the political vision, that's very clear, perfected quite well. Geographies have been identified. So Africa is one of the priorities, I said, but there's also Central Asia, the Indo-Pacific, Latin America. And flagships are being identified in theory as we speak, with some expected towards the end of the year. But yeah, nothing super specific as we speak. So this is where we're at. So very, very broadly speaking. Now, and in terms of, you know, what can this Global Gateway Initiative do to promote the energy transition in African countries? So on paper, there is sort of the energy dimension, the energy access and building energy interconnectors has been identified, as far as I'm aware, as a flagship to build in energy interconnectors for about 300 gigawatts of renewable energy generation by 2030. And there are a few other bits here and there, but again, this is not very specific. So what I want to say here is that what can Global Gateway do, or that at least we're hoping as a sort of civil society organization, because renewable energy cooperation between the EU and Africa is not new. There was an Africa-EU energy partnership since 2007, which aimed, at least on paper, for a lot of the same sort of goals. And it's also very much part of the development cooperation, of which a lot of the EU funds actually go to the climate dimension, the energy dimension. So what could be really different this time with this Global Gateway is, from our perspective, is to produce that sort of paradigm shift of relationships that would be centered rather around sort of economic cooperation that can help support sustainable clean development. So meaning not just a project here and a project there, but really support that transformation of economies in a sustainable way, which, you know, carries on once projects are over, and with those economic links, you know, continuing. And how so? Well, clearly the mobilization of those billions around building that sustainable and resilient economy is critical. So for us, the success when it comes to Global Gateway is actually mobilizing the Global Gateway for really operationalizing this paradigm shift. And making sure, as a result, so you've seen Global Gateway is pretty, sort of, it's a nice package at the moment with a lot of sort of buzzword attached to it, but it's to make sure that it's in its implementation, sort of the transition, or actually not the transition, sort of development along sort of a sustainable pathway is made a priority area. And that the EU would mobilize its own sort of toolbox as well to facilitate that sort of global economic restructuring needed around the clean transition. So Global Gateway is one aspect to build that partnership, but there are other many tools that you could put in place, and which I don't know if you've heard, you were at the European Development Days last week, where I listened carefully to what a lot of sort of African ministers and head of state said, that there is also a need, you know, for the EU to sort of set in motion a lot of its trade instruments that are at the moment fairly sort of inward designed in a fairly inward looking way to actually support African defined initiatives like the free trade areas, like projects that have been defined. And make sure that this cooperation is taking place on the equal partnership that has been touted by both sides, but which actually requires a bit of a rewiring of how that cooperation takes place. And I think Global Gateway could very much be a success of that, because that deep partnership of co-designing is, in our view, pretty central to making sure any sort of support to the transition is politically supported on the long run, with relationships that enable that. Sorry. Now, when it comes to how this plays out with other initiatives, because we know there's a lot of other infrastructure initiatives out there. It's fashionable since China launched this. So I think, first of all, I could actually talk to how the EU's approach is perhaps different from these other approaches that are out there. So I think one thing I kind of want to stress is that I don't think that Global Gateway has necessarily been launched against China. That's been picked up a lot in the media. But I think very much trying to build itself a bit of an alternative, and for that you need a unique selling point. And yeah, the EU is sort of selling the approach that it applies to itself and how it's doing things at home on a rules-based transparency approach, and hoping that this will sort of cut through as the best offer. So from this point of view, you could say it's taking a similar approach to the American Build Back Better or the PGI initiative that's been launched at the G7 or relaunched at the G7 recently. But really, compared to the other initiatives, it's actually one of the most detailed and most advanced one, comparing here to the US or the UK initiative, not the BRI, which obviously is around for much longer and has proven its ability to deliver projects. So yeah, but the potential of Global Gateway compared to perhaps other initiatives originates really from the fact that when it comes to the clean development or stable development, that it's the first continent to have had that climate law, that process of economic restructuring, and trying to deliver this as a driver of sustainable growth. So combined with that big economic clouds and experience in building a single market, like all of this experience with the experience around the Green Deal, it does have the potential to be that conduit for that support around the global clean economy transition, is how we see it. And I'm assuming my time is up. Thank you. 1 minute, okay. But I think I'm happy to leave it at that. I'm happy to take on questions later on then. Thanks.
Thank you, Leah. And just for me to pick up a couple of points, I think you mentioned the Global Gateway Initiative and the you had this constant refrain that it's on paper. So I was curious about that, and maybe you want to talk about that. You think the challenge is around operationalizing this, putting effectively Europeans actually committing to funding projects, but also operationalizing it. And then I think you mentioned that you didn't think it was a challenge to the BRI, and that you thought it provided an alternative anyway. So I'd like to invite the panelists to just open their cameras, Wigwe and Leah and Wei Shen, and then maybe for me to field 1 or 2 questions and open up to the floor. I was, I'm very interested in the how, particularly Wei Shen, and this might be more relevant to you, Wigwe, and I think Leah, you can also respond to this. After the post-FOCAC meeting last year, what are the developments around the vision for energy transition as far as the Chinese and Africans are concerned? What does that look like for you, and how will it materialize? And what are the building blocks that are already being put in place to give effect to that? Because you don't hear much about it in the media, and people are speculating and so on. So it's just like I presume you have lots of insider track, Shen Wei and Wigwe, maybe you want to comment on this. And Leah, you're also very welcome from an E3G perspective. So if we can start off with you, Wei Shen, and then I have other questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Salim. I'll try to answer through my observation from the China side. Maybe we may say something from the African side. I think it's everybody's actually assessing the impacts at the moment. That's the major task of most of the Chinese actors after this announcement. And first, they want to check how serious they are, the governments are on this announcement, because traditionally we all think that China is the top-down authoritarian kind of a way of governance, but traditionally, without kind of a willingness to cooperate from the private sectors or even from the local governments, the central policies went very far. So they want to check how, and they want to check not just the attitude from the government, but also the peers. They want to look at each other to see who is moving, who is not moving, and try to evaluate based on the peers' moves as well. So everybody's gonna. There are loads of webinars going on, but at the moment, some of the old kind of existing transactions that previously put on hold on renewables have been digging out as a kind of new, they think it's kind of a new blood, or put some kind of good opportunities to revive of some of this. And also some questions about other fossil fuel industry projects that are already, I think you mentioned one in Zimbabwe, and whether they can still go ahead or not. I think the baseline is that the Chinese companies, basically, they believe that there shouldn't be any commercial loss for them due to the decisions made by the central governments. So that's kind of a basic line, because particularly for the projects that are already in the final stage for the transaction closing, the penalties will be huge if China just quit the negotiation table. So how to figure out to actually exit these deals without any penalties and so on, that's going to be a tough negotiation. So of course, that's always closed behind closed doors. We can't get into the details of these negotiations, but I think the opportunities of renewables are already well recognized. So I think both the most active companies, if you look at it, are those ones who are most active in fossil fuel industries previously. China Nengjian is Energy China is most active. If you look at the deals they had in Nigeria, I think, let me check the project list now. Yeah, they had one in Nigeria and Zimbabwe, and also energy storage transaction.
Wait, is this a coal plant, or are you talking about oil and gas?
No, I think two projects in Nigeria one under negotiation. One is gas-fired power plants. The other is the other is solar, and in Kenya is solar as well. In Ethiopia, it's geothermal, and in South Africa, it's a energy storage facilities in the old coal mine. So they use the gasification technology. It's not. I don't know the detail, but it seems that it's related to energy storage. So yeah, but the Chinese companies want more support from the financial institutions, and the financial institutions are still evaluating the risks, because they are already dealing with large amount of sovereign debts across African continent. So you can't blame them to be a little bit overcautious at the moment. So there are a lot of discussions on how to move forward. I think for companies like Sinosure, the ECA, and China Exim Bank, there are still countries in Africa that they think that there are still green light or some capacity to do that. Nigeria is one of them. South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and probably Northern African countries. That's what I observed. Yeah, at the moment.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Ovikwe to just say something, and then Leah, I'll give you the floor as well. And then I see if I can invite people to just put questions on the chat, and I see there's two questions that I would like the panel to respond to. But Ovikwe, your opinion from the African perspective and China's role, and where you think things need to go from here. I'm reminded by Leah, everything's on paper, but what should happen in reality?
Well, what should happen in reality is we actually need to, to as quickly as possible move towards, renewable energy projects, because just like Wei-Shen was mentioning, yes, of course, I think there will be a lot of disappointment if we start seeing, those deals that are really near closure being cancelled. But if at the same time, many of in these countries that will be suffering those cancellations have already prepared maybe alternative proposals or the alternative projects that could be that could be exploited, I mean, alternative renewable energy projects or greener projects, then it's going to lessen the blow, because at the end of the day, it's not really that these African countries want coal-fire plants, or it's really about the energy at the end of the day, right? So we just want energy to be capacity to be greatly increased. If the momentum, if the ease, and if the environmental costs are factored into consideration, and then renewable energy becomes really really desirable, in many cases, it's even the best way forward. So while that is still there, I think the announcement that there will be no new coal-fired power plant was actually was shocking in a sense, because I don't think a lot of people expected it to be very, very sudden, right? But at the same time, if you look at even all of the conversation within the African continent, there is a clear recognition that coal, despite it's cheap and it's very much accessible to many countries, if we look at the risks that we are African countries are likely to face in the future, and even currently happening, then it's wiser to actually move towards the greener sources. The only issue being, like for Shem mentioned, contracts are already being negotiated. But secondly, how are we going to finance the financing for these renewable energy sources? Because that is going to be very, very crucial, going forward.
Thanks. Leah, do you want to pitch in here? I know
on
from the European
operationalizing.
perspective. Yeah.
I think there's two things here that you need to consider. It's the practical operationalizing and the credibility, which to me obviously are linked, but a bit different here. Making Global Gateway practical and happening, I mean, the finance is pretty much crucial. And that's what's been picked up since the start from civil society, journalists, and you're mentioning those 300 billions, that's huge. It's actually more than what the US has proposed in their newest version of their own initiative. And whilst there is a lot that can actually come on from the EU budget, it's actually very much about sort of leveraging that private finance. And that requires a bit of a rethink, I think, in terms of like de-risking, especially. So there are things that need to be put in place. I think I've heard last week Rana Hoye, the president of the EIB, talk about that. There's an awareness of that, and that's in a way the beauty of this Team Europe approach, which brings in the EIB, but also sort of national development as well. There is a need to deliver, and that's sort of clear and the message taken forward. And then there's the credibility part on the EU. And as I said, the partnership dimension is not a nice to have. It's not a, it's not a, okay, let's do things differently. It actually needs a complete different approach to this, especially if you want those investments to flow into, locally defined, nationally defined priorities. That requires, we have a lot of structures already happening at EU delegation level, also Team Europe. But I think it probably needs to be fully co-designed, and to materialize these projects. I think we hear a lot about the need of this pipeline of projects, which is missing. You hear that on the European side. At least what I heard from African stakeholders said it's not the case. I don't know. I'm not too much in the weeds of that, but basically this discussion needs to happen, and it needs to sort of feed that new approach, which is long overdue. Besides infrastructure investments.
Thanks. There are two questions from the audience, and one is from David Thomas. Maybe we'll go for this one first before I go to Kenichi Doi. To what degree does the panel see Africa's green energy development as dependent on private capital? And what effect does the panel expect rising interest rate, which I thought is a very good question, in the US and Europe elsewhere, have on the availability of capital in Africa? As you know, the cost of average cost of renewables, even though it's globally seen, cost curves come down very rapidly, also with storage. But the average cost of actually financing projects in Africa is still high, and the kilowatt hour costs are still high. So would this be an opportunity or constraint now with interest rates? And given that private capital can't really do these projects also without the support of public finance, they're very crucial. and are very curious as to how the Global Gateway Initiative can actually help with it, and Wei Shen and Ovigwe, Chinese public finance. So can we start off with that first question, and then I'll go to the next one. I don't know who wants to start. Leah, you want to go? Yeah.
Sure. So I think part of the answer, I mean, you give it yourself, is around blended finance anyway. But here, just to actually echo what I've heard around that topic from sort of asset managers, among others, is that there seems to be within the investment community, I mean, a clear awareness and also capability to invest a lot of the money. There is, a problem in sort of investing huge amount of capital in the energy sector, which is also a problem in, Europe, for example. It's not just a problem, say, in Africa. So basically, it was very much framed as around sort of fulfilling this sort of expectation gap, this possibility, but sort of from a private, asset manager, the fact that a lot of these asset owners, they have the capacity, but they don't have necessarily the precise mandates to invest in sort of low to middle income countries. And so they need that rationale to sort of, which connects that scarcity of suitable investment opportunity according to them. And there were a few things that I thought were mentioned were interesting, is they need access to data. Making sure, expose reporting on transparency requirement for their portfolio, and they need to know, carbon data access, basically, of projects. They also mention financial instrument and also a suitable sort of risk return profile. So as much as I'm not a financial expert around the inflation rate, I'm sure it plays a role, but it seems that there's sort of bigger structural problems to fix as well, next to some of those sort of more sort of current problem like inflation.
So can
you can go ahead.
Very quick reflection. I think, of course, public and private finance are all needed during given the gap we have, but I think private finance shouldn't be viewed as a kind of a last resort when public finance is no longer available. That's the problem. It's like, when many countries, many governments kind of started to think about private finance when the public finance drying up. And that really hurts the motivations from private sector. And really make them more hesitating about risks and so on. And also another political struggle is that among most African countries, there is a monopolistic energy utility, which will by nature have some conflict of interest with private investment. And so that's why the progress of private investment should be in line with the energy sector reforms, which obviously varies from country to country. And just to use one example, in Ethiopia, which has done the research, is like, Ethiopian government officials, they compare the public projects with the proposed private ones. They believe that public projects are more efficient. That's what we're told by the utility company. So there needs many kind of ideological and institutional struggles underneath the private investment, which further exacerbating the risks. So different challenges, but I think the ideal scenario is that we see public sectors and private sectors work hand in hand. That's always kind of the basis for PPP and structured finance or blended finance. But again, this ideal picture can be hard to achieve from country to country. I think that's some kind of basic jobs we need to do before we discuss whether private sectors can play a role or not.
Ovigwe.
Yeah, I think, brilliant points from Leah and Wei. For me, one of the things African countries can actually do to boost enthusiasm or interest from the private side is actually to do more of regionalized electricity markets, because that would really make the return on investment really high. And for me, that the fragmentation is a huge headache, because just look, maybe for instance, a country with a population of, Nigeria about 200 million people, huge market, right? But the potential or the interest that Nigeria would arouse in the private sector cannot be the same with a country like Senegal that's about 19 million, right? So, but if we move towards really creating like regional electricity markets, and that is really what a lot of African Union RECs or regional economic communities are doing now. West Africa is really moving ahead strongly with that to create some like a West African integrated power grid. That means that goes from a few 100 million to several hundred millions when you do that. So I think that would be very important for private sector interest. However, I would always say there are just some projects that are viewed from a very strategic point of view that governments really do not have the patience, if they can, to wait for private sector and even want to get into the complexities of that. They just want to finance those type of projects if they think they can self-finance. Again, Ethiopia is a very, very good example with the GERD. You can go ask left, right, center, east, west, nobody's giving you money. Like, sure, we're just going to do this by ourselves and complete it by all means necessary. So, because I always like to emphasize when we're talking about energy, it is very crucial to understand the urgency of the situation we're talking about here. It is easy to say 600 million people, on paper, right? But that's 600 million people with no access to electricity. There are several millions more people who have access to electricity, but it's just not,
reliable. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm talking to you right now. I don't have power, right?
Same here, by the way.
I've not had power since 11 p.m. last night. I had to go charge my laptop, at a friend's place.
We are on load shedding number 6. So that's 6 hours of no power. Yes. But
you can imagine. So 11 p.m., 11 a.m., 12 hours for me already. So the productivity costs of this is huge, and that's why that is driving most of the the disregard towards talk about environmentalism. These countries understand that energy now, energy first, and many times I think that's really missing in how development partners or countries that we're working with are viewing the landscape in the continent.
Can I just mention a few points? I was reading yesterday a very interesting study by UCT. In fact, it's your fellow Nigerian Ola Kunle, by the way, who is a PhD student, did a fascinating piece of work looking at the independent power producers program on the continent. And what we're seeing is a massive, with the right DFI support, public and guarantees and credit enhancement mechanisms outside of South Africa, it's starting to pick up. In South Africa alone, with the sovereign guarantees, private capital and other public institutions that are looking for better returns, have been able to invest in a very large IPP program in South Africa. What is crucial, I think the study mentions, is that there are very interesting developments. The one is that the cost of IPP auction model, using an auction model, and if you did it in a staggered way of different windows, you can find that the cost of renewables have come down. For example, in South Africa, we started with 14 cents a kilowatt hour US. We're down to 227 kilowatt hours. This is how rapidly the costs have come down. Solar PV is receiving the highest investments. And what's fascinating is that as battery technology the costs are coming down, battery energy storage systems combined with PV, there are increasing projects like this starting to happen on the continent. Just recently, for an emergency program in South Africa, we had the first one by a Norwegian company called Scatec. And also, more importantly, the transmission capacity needs to be improved, as you mentioned. And what I liked about your point, which is often not picked up on, if we had a good regional power pools that had the capital and the assets and the interconnections, we actually could have a better integrated renewables and decarbonize electricity grid. East Africa is the best case example. You could go 100% decarbonize with the Grand Renaissance project, other hydro projects, plus geothermal and renewables. You can reduce variability with those sources with a more integrated system. And obviously, national interests are driving this fragmentation rather than a more sub-regional. So I do think that there's a huge opportunity for that. I want to move the panel onto two more questions, if you don't mind. I think there's three now. The first is around, let's take this one first. Do the panelists, probably Dr. Polsner and Dr. Shen, think renewable energy sector investments, even funded by traditional donors, Western countries and Japan, would rely on Chinese suppliers to some extent, concerning the remarkable presence of Chinese companies in PV and other renewable energy? So I think the question is, hidden in it is the geopolitics that's emerging, the rivalry. In fact, in the US, they're blocking Chinese PV from entering because of tariffs and so on. And there's cases in the WTO. If there are, for example, initiatives funded by now the new global infrastructure partnership under G7, and then also the Global Gateway Initiative, we don't talk about those hidden things. Would that finance be used, even if there were EPC contracts, using Chinese technology? I think that's really what people are asking. Response, Wei and Leah?
First of all, I think if there's a direct export from China to African destinations, there shouldn't be any kind of a tariff embargo and so on, because most of the tariff and restrictions are actually imposed by the EU and the US in the moment, and then including some of the Southeast Asian markets. For example, if it is Chinese factory opening up in Vietnam and want to shipping panels into US market, that could be problematic. But I never heard of any problems by shipping or exporting from China to African markets. So I think since kind of 70% of the Chinese panels are for overseas markets, so it is very difficult to avoid Chinese solar panels nowadays. And it's about, I think, 80% or even more of the manufacturing capacity of solar panels are from China. And it's not just the panels or batteries, it's about, polysilicon resources as well. And think about the shooting price of polysilicon is about 300% already in the past 12 years. Right. So it's really affecting the cost of everything. But it's more or less like inevitable. You have to buy from the Chinese companies from time to time. But
unless manufacturing can shift, right? Unless you can shift the manufacturing.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. It's like unless there's some of the capacity that can be shifted up to the African countries. That linked to your discussion about the regional pool. It's not just about pool of electricity generation, but also manufacturing capacities.
Right.
But in order to achieve that successfully, you need a regional planning entity.
Right.
That is the biggest obstacle.
Right.
And you have to make sure that the PPA between two countries can exist, can be effective for 30 or 40 years, despite all the difficulties among different countries. That's gonna be difficult, right? So you need to have a regional capacity with institution with the authority to coordinate among different governments, right?
Leah, maybe Vikwe, you also may want to respond to this.
Yeah, sure. I'll just pick up on the more geopolitical dimension of this question. I think for the EU that will be a clear sort of conflict of various interests. Obviously, the support for the transition, which is obviously built into what the EU is at the moment, a Green Deal agenda, but then, the whole rules and standards and values around things like, the EU's putting in place sort of legislation around due diligence, for example, and looking at things like how sort of human rights feed into that and other sort of values. And that's the problem that the EU has at the moment, of having a variety of interests and not necessarily having the tools to conduct all of this together coherently, and not sort of undercutting one, for pursuing the other, which we've seen in other places. So I think, very practically speaking, whilst waiting for a sort of Green Deal diplomacy to emerge, to actually make this happen, which isn't completely out of the picture, given that there is a European Council process around that. That just really highlights the need for the EU and the other sort of infrastructure initiatives to sort of sit down at one table with the Chinese and sort of discuss when it comes to sort of supporting that sustainable development in China, in Africa. So that's kind of a need to sort of coordinate perhaps on some of these standards and some of these rules and values, which through the Green BRI there might be appetite for. And I think at MDB level it is already happening. And then from the sort of pure EU perspective, what I said when it comes to sort of not like forfeit just plain investments, for sort of actually supporting sort of green industrialization and making sure that these investments actually lead to sort of these capacities, building the capacity for manufacturing and all, in these countries, and not just sort of one-off investments where the technology stays, where the investment came from, for example.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Vigve, do you want to say something on this, on the geopolitics?
Yeah,
I know you're a good scholar of geopolitics.
It will be very devastating to Africa's energy. I wouldn't say transition now, more like to closing Africa's energy gap. If that scenario actually plays out, where right, financing cannot be used to purchase equipment, because just like Mr. Shen was mentioning, even if you can bypass that by shifting manufacturing to Africa, you need industrial energy to be able to actually have the manufacturing capacity in the first place. So if you don't have the energy to do the manufacturing of the solar panels, there's really no point even trying to talk about shifting manufacturing to the continent. That's one. Second point, I think it's in a very practical point of view, that scenario is very likely the case where we cannot, tariffs and embargoes will be a problem, because recall last year, the EU there was this statement where they says it would be, and I'm paraphrasing, it would not be plausible to finance for European or global grid or whatever the package is, to finance a road to connect to a Chinese finance port, right? So if they're not going to do that with transportation, I can almost see them not doing that with energy as well. So if there's anything that I think it's a major problem for in terms of Africa's,
but can I ask?
It's really the geopolitics of it and this rivalry. It's really problematic.
Clarity. I mean, a lot of firms that are manufacturing the equipment in China, aren't they invested by also European firms? For example, VW is in Xinjiang province. Nobody talks about that. But would they not be shooting themselves in the foot, given that lots of PV manufacturing and so on is also invested by non-Chinese firms? I was just curious. I don't know the answer to that. Wei Shen, or are they all pure Chinese firms?
Nowadays, most of the solar PV manufacturers are pure Chinese companies, and
right,
there are very little private foreign investment in these areas. But for wind industry, that's different.
It's more complicated.
Chinese wind turbines are much less competitive compared to solar panels, because Vestas, GE, these being international brands for many years, and most of the Chinese wind energy companies are just focusing on domestic market. So they are mainly kind of infant players in the international market. But solar PV is pretty Chinese owned by themselves. But I would like to come back to these like chicken and egg problems, that if we want to shift the manufacturing capacities, if there's any chance, obviously guaranteeing baseload energy is crucial. And I think in terms of energy justice, we should guarantee Africa should not be disadvantaged further by any decisions of stopping fossil fuel investment. That should be the basic kind of a baseline that we're talking about. either the base load can be from hydro, can be from hybrid systems, but there must be some base load investment for that, and as a precondition to talk about green energy transition.
Thank you. I think Belinda has reminded me that we need to wrap up because I also want to give Sam Gill to make some closing remarks. I want to invite the speakers to just for less than 1 minute, some concluding observations that you would like to share. And maybe Leah also, there's a question around the nature of the infrastructure, Global Gateway Infrastructure Program, and whether it has similarities to China. But if I could start off with you to just quickly respond, and please, 1 minute, less than 1 minute, if you don't mind. Leah, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry, I was still reading a question. Yeah, I think just to wrap up now on sort of the EU initiative, I think, and that's my own opinion, is for this to sort of work, it really needs to start from the needs, like defining the needs, as Ovikwe mentioned, what are the needs that Africa is after, and they will differ from country to country and region to region. So not take this as a speaking to the African Union is great, but that alone won't probably cut it. But also taking into account that the EU needs this to be geopolitical, to have a sort of a return on investment, and sort of that sort of visibility dimension will sort of still be there, and sort of be aware of that this shouldn't undermine the whole project. And I think if you want me to speak to the question on the difference from the Chinese BRI, so I wouldn't be able to speak to the BRI itself, but just from the global gateway perspective, I think it's really that sort of whole engagement strategy with that focus on sort of hard infrastructure, but also soft infrastructure, the way the Commission puts it, around also including things like health, education, research. And that's where my hope lies, because infrastructure alone won't necessarily, do everything. And sort of it's that sort of mix that's hopefully will do the trick, and hopefully that sort of also reform of how the EU is able to unlock that sort of private capital together with the public one. That would be quite key. Thank you.
Wei Shen, less than 1 minute, if you don't mind. Any last observation?
Very quickly, I think I want to come back to the point of learning. I think in a transition period like this, and I think it is, first, I think all the positive policy changes that we witnessed in the past 2 or 3 years is really due to the kind of a constant push from everyone, I think, from private sector, NGOs, and public sectors and at the international level. So we should continue to do that. I think that's the way, because when people sitting on their past success, they don't want to change into a more difficult and challenging path. That's why we need to keep pushing them to learn how to develop smaller, more, in their language, small but beautiful projects. But at the same time, do not actually give up their advantages in some areas. And so I think mutual learning is very important in this way, and not just learn from EU and from the counterparts, but also from local communities and local governments. Try to stay with the demand-driven approach during this learning process. I think that's kind of my key aspiration out of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ovikwe, very quickly, less than 1 minute, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I think currently the way the transition is being carried out, it's not the same for everyone. For Western countries, for developed and advanced economies, the transition is more of a disruption, right? Because but for Africa, like I was talking to someone very recently, for us, the threat is really stagnation. It's very, very different, because if you are saying you can't make investments in this in fossil fuel and renewables, there's so much politics around where the financing and cooperation, then it means we're having this type of webinars maybe in 2040s with the same problems. Right, so we cannot afford to do that, because hundreds of millions of lives are at stake, and livelihoods, and aspirations of people. So we have to be very pragmatic and very realistic to understand the issues that certain regions of the world, is facing. And that is key, and that's foundational.
Thank you very much. I want to really thank the panelists. I'm just going to say 3 points. The one is that we have to make an energy transition to decarbonization. It's a public good. It's a public interest. We have to do that against very competitive and rivalrous geopolitics. And we have to achieve a public set of public investments with private money in which commercial return is going to come into conflict with all of these two other things that I just mentioned. And I want to really thank you and the audience for giving me the pleasure to chair this really fascinating and really, we've only touched the surface. So Sam, I'm going to invite you to make concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your sharing, Salim. It's been really fantastic and just a fantastic conversation. Really, really enjoyed it. Yeah, just to briefly give some remarks that won't do justice at all, given the richness of the conversation. I mean, I found myself reflecting sort of at the end of this conversation on how, at least since COP26, but certainly even more as the global geopolitical landscape has grown more tense, there's been a lot of discussion about competition versus cooperation in climate change. And, it's something I'm sort of constantly asked and find myself speaking to and having to sort of challenge it by saying, to what extent, are those really mutually exclusive dynamics? Can we see a race to the top between, big investors in the African continent, where healthy competition is driving attempts to improve the quality of infrastructure investment, and this kind of trilateral cooperation that we're talking about can coexist? But I also thought, sort of listening to this conversation, that it points to the possibility of that trilateral cooperation as something that already exists, really based on kind of these very pragmatic, constructive conversations that we're able to have when we center the importance of that acceleration and ambition of low carbon infrastructure, and whether we're even asking the right questions, because in the end, for people, for government, for stakeholders on the African continent, it isn't really that matters. We need to actually be asking better questions that that this conversation has already been pulling out around the quality and composition of investment, around technology transfer, around the social and justice dimensions of infrastructure initiatives. So I thought, Ivigwe's discussion of the sort of spillover effects and co-benefits of foreign investment, how to move away from an extractive model, and how to radically scale what we're already starting to see. So yes, the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa is a step in the right direction. Yes, what we've seen on the basis of high-level commitments at FOCAC is also moving in the right direction, but this is really small compared to where we need to be, and there's an enormous potential for renewables investment and for doing that in a way that is just. Wei Shen, I think, really adds to the kind of granularity of that as well, in talking about how Chinese companies are starting to notice this new direction of travel. Emboldened by Xi Jinping's statement in late 2021 on stopping coal funding overseas, we've seen companies starting to invest in new renewables projects. But there's still big question marks, particularly around, for example, the question of technology transfer, to what extent state-owned enterprises are motivated to share technology, to really think about where that's needed. And his research brings out that contrast with private companies who are typically much happier to be suppliers and potentially to act in that more kind of demand-driven way that Wei mentions. And then finally, I think it's really valuable that Leah was able to sort of add to the conversation by filling in what we don't know and what we need to know around the Global Gateway Initiative, and how to turn that admirable and huge financial commitment into something that sees the progress on the ground and opens up that sort of healthy competition, ideally, in my opinion, rather than purely being seen in sort of geopolitically in terms of a kind of geopolitical battlefield. And in all of this, the details really matter. That we really need to keep the focus on high quality, fact-based narrative, fact-based reporting and constructive dialogue. And in that vein, China Dialogue, E3G, and actually all of the partners here on this call and represented by these speakers are going to be continuing to work on, publish, host discussions on the role of China's investment in renewable energy in Africa, as well as that potential for trilateral cooperation, particularly as G7 countries sort of signal that they're trying to get back in the game on supporting infrastructure in the developing world, and doing that in a way that is consonant with the Paris Agreement, with protecting natural systems, with protecting social justice and indeed development aspirations. And we'll be looking at how we can, harness existing examples on the ground and look at, what already exists out there. We're publishing a series of on-the-ground reports on ChinaDialogue.net on Chinese renewable energy investments in Africa. So there's been a couple so far, including a really interesting piece about Kenya's potential for electric vehicles and the really huge kind of potential for for greater investment in that area, and the potential ramifications industrially, socially, economically, environmentally. And we've also got a discussion with Wei Shen about a big report we want to do on trilateral cooperation. So lots more coming up on the road to COP27. So it remains for me to thank our chair again, thank our panelists, thank our attendees for coming. I thought that was really valuable, and have a good day, everyone. Thank you.